So welcome back. Since the wonderful violinist and musical raconteur Aaron Boyd is going to be here in a week to do his own encounter on the string quartets of Haydn, I'm going to circumnavigate that essential component of Haydn's repertoire, and I'm going to go into what is probably the least familiar corner of his repertoire today, which is his life as an opera composer and an opera impresario. From 1768 until the end of the prince's life, Prince Nicholas's life in 1790, his main responsibility at Esterházy was to preside over this operatic world there. And there was a 400-seat opera house that was built into the structure. It was inaugurated in 1768. This is what it looked like. This is the blueprint. And then in 1773, they added or completed the Marionette Theater, and there were marionette operas there as well. And from 1776 until 1790, they had full operatic seasons. And there are documented over 1,000 performances of operas that took place at Esterházy during that period. And Haydn conducted every single one of them. He also coached the singers when they needed extra arias or they needed substitute arias. He would do that. So opera was very much a part of his life. And again, we don't really think of it that way. The first opera that he wrote for Prince Nicholas was called Lo Speziale. It's the Apothecary. And it is a comic opera that he wrote to inaugurate this theater. And it set the tone for the operas to come. The Prince liked funny operas, and this one is apparently quite a funny opera. I'll play you a little bit of a duet, very charming, lilting duet. The two young protagonists, the lovers, are singing. As we hear, it is beguilingly lovely music, and it is eminently singable. And why not? Because from his earliest years, as we have heard, he was a singer himself, and he had this great ability to write beautiful lyrical melodies. In ways, it's reminiscent of Mozart, and it has its own characteristics. And the question always arises, so why isn't his opera music known more than it is? And I think the answer is we don't know. I think he suffers, I think, in his operatic repertoire, perhaps more than any other repertoire, by not being Mozart. And I think he didn't have a sympathetic librettist along the lines of Lorenzo da Ponte. And so his comic operas, I don't think, are quite as funny as The Marriage of Figaro. His dramatic operas are not quite as dramatic as Don Giovanni. And yet, as you hear, he had the goods, and he wrote operas. Apparently, he wrote something in the neighborhood of 15 full-length operas. Sometimes I've read as many as 18. It seems to be a little unsure because in 1779, this opera theater that you were looking at burned down. And a lot of the operas that he had written were in score form, taken with it. But anyway, he wrote a lot of operas. And in 1773, I mentioned that there were marionette operas that took place, and so they inaugurated the Marionette Theater there. And the first of the marionette operas that he wrote was called Philemon and Baucis. And these marionette operas were very well suited for themes of fantasy. This one, it takes its plot from a moralistic tale from Ovid. And so what you have is a story about the god Jupiter, the king of the gods. He comes down to the planet Earth along with his sidekick Mercury, his messenger god. And he's on this mission to find a virtuous couple. Because if he can't find anybody who's virtuous down here, I think he's ready to just do away with all of us entirely, and who can blame him? So when he comes down, he meets this bereaved, kindly couple named Philemon and Baucis. And they are bereaved because they have a son who has died on his wedding day along with his bride when an errant bolt of lightning came down and incinerated them. And yet, with this great grief that he's handling, still these two people are so kindly, they are so hospitable, that they succeed in turning Jupiter's ideas about humanity around, and he decides to let us survive after all. And at the end, Jupiter comes out and he expresses his beneficence towards humanity and towards Philemon and Baucis, and the people praise him.
Dann könnt ihr die Partitur in Ruhe schließen.
Now, of course, Haydn didn't write the 1,000 operas that he conducted. Many of them were written by well-known opera composers of the day, like Salieri and Cimarosa and Paisiello. And while he was there, these operas were oftentimes written to celebrate distinguished personages who would come to visit Esterházy. One wonders, I mean, with this place out in the middle of the swamp, how many people came of these 1,000 operas. And somebody once wrote, apart from the servants, the prince is the whole audience, which is hard to imagine, and obviously not true, because people did come. Among the people who came was the Empress Maria Theresa, and they made a big deal, of course, and Haydn wrote an opera to celebrate her arrival, and she heard, I think, the first performance of Philemon and Baucis, and there were also performances of symphonies and great banquets and fireworks, and I think one of the banquets was in the Chinese pavilion, and from what I've read, Haydn and his musicians dressed up in Chinese costumes. These were big events. But again, it's not really clear how many people really came to these operas over the course of the 22 years or so that he was writing them. The prince was also a great connoisseur of theater, and he liked to import theatrical troupes, and they would perform plays by Molière and plays by Shakespeare. Sometimes he would ask his concertmaster, his Kapellmeister, Haydn, to write incidental music for these plays. And so, in a sense, it was like film music. He was sort of the John Williams or the Erich Korngold of Esterházy as well. And sometimes he would take the music that he had written as incidental music and he would reuse it in his symphonies. There's one that he wrote, Symphony number 60 in C major, subtitled Il Distratto, the distracted, because all of the music has as a theme forgetfulness, because there's the story is, I think it's called The Absent-Minded Gentleman. And you'll hear in the first movement, I'll play you a bit of it, and the music is going along swimmingly. And then at a certain point, we begin to notice that the music has lost its way and it's kind of going around in a circle as it tries to figure out where it's headed. And finally, it begins to decay and just stop in bewilderment. if you like funny Haydn, this is your piece. It's got 6 movements, actually. And the last movement has what I would consider to be the most startling joke of all at the beginning. Take 2. So, Haydn, at this time in his life, his music was becoming well known all across Europe, but he wasn't getting reimbursed for the music that was traveling without him. Because as you remember, going back to 1761, one of the points in his contract was he wasn't able to accept commissions, or he wasn't able to publish his own music. And in 1779, he got fed up with this. And so he renegotiated his contract with Prince Nicholas, and he made sure to allow himself to accept publications, accept commissions. And from that point on, he became a very wealthy and very famous composer. And as it happens, just about that time, there was a famous publishing house called Artaria, located in Vienna, and they were publishing books, and they decided they would also publish music. And this was a banner moment both for Haydn and Artaria. And they began to publish his piano sonatas. One of the first sets was a set of 6 piano sonatas, which they published. And from this point on, Haydn became more and more famous and more wealthy and really more and more shrewd. You know, he had been taken advantage of over the last 18 years by unscrupulous copyists and by pirate editions, and I think he was fed up with it. And so now he was not above publishing a piece in Amsterdam and then publishing the same piece in London and publishing the same piece in, Vienna. And it got him into a little bit of trouble from time to time. But, I think he felt justified. There were no copyright laws. In any event, he developed a pretty good relationship with this firm, Artaria. And not long after he published these piano sonatas, he published Opus 33, his 6 string quartets. These are very groundbreaking string quartets. They follow, I'm sure Aaron will talk about the Opus 20 set and then this Opus 33 set. They were appealing to connoisseurs. And among the connoisseurs who really was challenged by these pieces was Mozart, who was so taken with them. He had written, I think, about 17 string quartets of his own by the time that these were published. Nothing like these. And when he saw what was possible, he said, I will write my own very challenging string quartets. And so in the middle years of the 1780s, he wrote 6 of his own, which he had Artaria publish as Opus 10. And as I said very early on, they are known confusingly as Mozart's Haydn quartets because they're dedicated to his friend Haydn. And Haydn and Mozart really had probably the greatest mutual admiration society between 2 truly great composers that ever was. And to give you a sense of that, I'll read you a bit of this dedication. To my dear friend Haydn, a father who had resolved to send his children out into the great world took it to be his duty to confide them to the protection and the guidance of a very celebrated man, especially when the latter, by good fortune, was at the same time his best friend. Here they are, O great man and dearest friend, these 6 children of mine. They are, it is true, the fruit of a long and laborious endeavor. May it therefore please you to receive them kindly and to be their father, guide, and friend. And this relationship was very close, and there was a kind of a premiere reading of these quartets, or at least some of these quartets, in Mozart's apartment in Vienna. Haydn came, they played string quartets together. Oh, to be a fly on the wall to hear Haydn and Mozart playing string quartets together at that event. And among the people who was there was Mozart's father. His name was Leopold. And of course, he was just such nachas he had. He says, Herr Haydn said to me, I tell you before God and as an honest man that your son is the greatest composer I know, either personally or by reputation. I mean, they just had this reciprocal kind of a feeling for each other. And now that he was accepting commissions, these commissions came flooding in from all over Europe, from as far away as the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula in Cadiz, where there was this very ornate small church called the Church of La Cueva, the Church of a Cave. And it was presided over by this gentleman, Padre Santa Maria, very sophisticated man, music lover. And he was in the habit on Good Friday of having readings out loud of the 7 last words of Christ. And he would sermonize on them. And he wanted somebody to write illustrative sonatas that would give you a musical perspective on them. And so he reached 3,000 kilometers across Europe to Esterházy, and he commissioned Haydn to write these. And these became known as his wordless oratorios. They are his great masterpieces of liturgical music. And again, he rewrote them a number of times, reorchestrated them, each time taking another publishing fee. He originally wrote them for a large orchestra, then for a firm called Forster in England. He orchestrated them for string quartet. They've been done in that form here at Music at Menlo, for piano reduction. At the end of his life in the early 19th century, he rewrote them again, expanding them for full orchestra with vocal soloists and choir, and he took another publishing fee for that as well. He was shrewd, but that was his nature as well. And of course, the better known he got, the more people wanted to have him come and visit, particularly in England, where, again, he couldn't go because he was socked into his many duties up in Esterházy. And this became a source of frustration, not only to him, but also to the British, who loved his music from the early 1780s onward, and they wanted nothing more than to have Haydn come. And finally, somebody wrote an article in the Gazetteer, and he sort of jokingly said, maybe we could send out some kind of a musical commando team to Esterházy to kidnap Haydn and bring him here to London. I'll read you a bit of the letter. This wonderful man, who is the Shakespeare of music and the triumph of the age in which we live, is doomed to reside at the court of a miserable German prince, who is at once incapable of rewarding him and unworthy of the honor. There, Haydn is content to live immured in a place little better than a dungeon, subject to the domineering spirit of a petty lord and the clamorous temper of a scolding wife. Would it not be an achievement equal to a pilgrimage for some aspiring youths to rescue him from his fortune and transplant him to Great Britain, the country for which his music seems to be made? And he was loved. His music was also very popular in Paris, and there was a very well-heeled Masonic lodge in the 1780s that commissioned 6 large-scale symphonies from him, really much larger than anything that he had ever written before at Esterházy. The orchestra was twice as large and had more different kinds of instruments. And he completed this commission, and everybody loved it. And Queen Marie Antoinette, she loved the 4th in particular, which after her became known as La Reine, the Queen, because it has this kind of French overture, regal style in the introduction at the beginning. But again, Haydn wasn't able to go. He was still up in Esterházy, and he wasn't able to go and bask in the Queen's admiration. And this became a bit frustrating for him. And around this time, he was developing relationships of various kinds with various women. He had a long-term relationship with a court singer named Luigia Polzelli. And they were very close for a long time. Apparently she was really not much of a singer, and she wasn't his intellectual equal. She wasn't even that much of a companion, but apparently she had other kinds of attractions to him. But for women who were connoisseurs and more sophisticated, probably his favorite female companion was a lady named Marianne von Genzinger. And this was a platonic relationship. She was married to the doctor of Prince Nicholas, and she had a large music-loving family in a palace in Vienna. And he liked her very much, to the point where he wrote a lot of letters to her in which he became more and more intimate and more unburdening himself of his frustrations around that time. And she was very fond of him as well, and apparently she was quite a good pianist, so he dedicated piano pieces to her. This is one of them. This is his E-flat major piano sonata, which he wrote for her, which sounds like this. On Sunday evenings in Vienna, she liked to have these large musicales, and she would invite Haydn and other musicians, and her family, again, was all musically talented. And these were extremely gratifying evenings for Haydn, and I think in a sense they probably satisfied a craving for intellectual companionship with a woman of her station, and also he didn't have his own children, he didn't really have a family, so he liked this experience, and she was apparently just a marvelous hostess. And they would play his music, and they would have wonderful times and feast, and then he would go back to Esterházy, and I think going back became more and more disappointing. And at one point, he wrote a letter to her in the wake of one of these weekends there, and you can hear the melancholy in his written voice now. Well, here I sit in my wilderness, forsaken, like some poor orphan, almost without human society. Melancholy, dwelling on the memory of past glorious days. Yes, past, alas. And who can tell when those happy hours may return? Those charming meetings where the whole circle had but one heart and one soul. All those delightful musical evenings that can only be remembered and not described. You must forgive a man whom the Viennese have so terribly spoiled. I beg your grace not to shy away from comforting me by your pleasant letters, for they cheer me up in my isolation and are highly necessary for my heart, which is often very deeply hurt. It's a side of Haydn that we don't usually think of. But little did he know that freedom was really just around the corner as he was writing this letter. In late September of 1790, Prince Nicholas died, and he was succeeded by his son, Prince Anton. And he was a very different kind of a man than Prince Nicholas or his uncle, Prince Paul Anton. He was like they were. He was a military commander, but I think the resemblance stopped there. He didn't particularly like music, and he disbanded, in the name of saving money, this elaborate musical establishment at Esterházy, and he just pensioned off Haydn. In many ways, I think he was a man far ahead of his time. And so you would think that Haydn, he's now 58 years old, he's worked half his life for Esterházy. This must have been a traumatic moment in his life. And yet, as we heard in that letter that he wrote to Marianne von Genzinger, he was ready. And a little bit later, he wrote a letter to her, and he said, "Oh, my dear gracious lady, how sweet this bit of freedom really is. I had a kind prince, but sometimes I was forced to be dependent on base souls. I often sighed for release, and now I have it in some measure." And so he flew out of this gilded cage there at Esterházy, and he landed in Vienna and began to contemplate what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. And of course, he was so well known by this time that the offers came flooding in from all over Europe. the King of Naples said, come down and be my music director. And in Pressburg, which we know now as Bratislava, he was offered a position there to be the Kapellmeister. And all of these were very attractive offers, and he was mulling them over. And one day, there was a knock on the door, and in walked a stranger who said, I am Solomon from London, and I have come to fetch you. Tomorrow we shall conclude an agreement. And this was Johann Peter Solomon. He originally came from Bonn, where Beethoven was from. And he was a violinist and a conductor, but he had long since moved to England, and he had become an impresario. And there was this great rivalry among the British impresarios to see who could finally get Haydn to come to London. And at the time that Prince Nicholas died, he was on a recruiting mission bringing musical talent. And he was in Cologne, and he heard that the prince had died, and he said, oh, that's too bad, I'm going to Vienna. And he went to Vienna, and he looked up Haydn, and he made him an offer that he could not refuse. He offered him a lot of money. He said, we're going to commission you to write a full opera and 6 symphonies, and we're going to take you to London, and we're going to make you, you're going to be a celebrity there. And Haydn said, fine, let's go. And so at the end of December, he was getting ready to go, and he had a visit from Mozart. And Mozart came, and Mozart was not sure that this was an entirely good idea. I mean, Haydn, from his perspective, was an old man. He was 58 years old. And he had never traveled. And Mozart just didn't, he thought, this is going to be too arduous for you. He said, Papa, you have no training for the great world, and you speak too few languages. And Haydn said, oh, my language is understood all over the world. So they had dinner. And at the end, as they were parting, Mozart said, rather mysteriously, we are probably saying our last farewell in this life. And, you can only imagine that Haydn, looking at this 34-year-old man, is thinking, well, he thinks I'm just not up to the task. I'm not going to be able to survive this arduous journey. He could not have imagined that it was Mozart himself who within a year would be dead. So he and Solomon, they packed up, they got in the coach, they headed across Europe toward Calais. They stopped at Bonn, where, again, Solomon was from. There, Haydn met Beethoven, who was 20 years old at the time, very taken with this young man and his level of talent. They continued on. They arrived in Calais on New Year's Eve, 1790, got in the next morning onto a ship. They headed across the Channel. They arrived in Dover on New Year's Day, 1791. And this was quite an experience for Haydn, because even though he was 58, he'd never seen the ocean before. And he wrote about this experience. He said, I remained on deck during the entire passage so as to gaze my fill at that mighty monster, the ocean. So long as it was calm, I wasn't afraid at all. But as the wind grew stronger and stronger, and I saw the monstrous high waves rushing at us, I became a little frightened and a little indisposed, too. But I overcame it all, and I arrived safely, without vomiting, on shore. And they got into another boat, and they headed around up to London. And London was just awe-inspiring for him. Relative to Vienna, it was 3 or 4 times the size of London. The economy was just far outshone any other city in Europe at that time. And he was fascinated by this trip, and he kept chronicles of his whole trip. And they're fun to read. And he would describe statistically the difference in the scale of the economy, but he would also write a lot about the British people themselves, who kind of puzzled and mystified and amazed him at first, particularly the Quakers. At one point he says, in London, if anyone steals 2 pounds, he is hanged. But if I trust anybody with 2,000 pounds and he carries it off to the devil, he is acquitted. And as I say, the Quakers, they have these circuitous customs, and he writes about them. He says, when a Quaker goes to court, he pays the doorkeeper to take off his hat for him, for a Quaker takes off his hat for no one. And he also says, in order to pay the king's tax, an official goes to a Quaker's house during the period when the tax is being collected, and in his presence, he robs the Quaker of as many goods as represent the tax. When the disguised thief leaves the door with his goods, the Quaker calls him back and asks him how much money he wants for the stolen goods. The official demands just the amount of the tax, and in that way, the Quaker pays the tax to the king. So this was kind of mystifying to him, but everybody wanted to meet the celebrated Mr. Haydn, and he was greeted with this whirlwind of activity. The royal family wanted to meet him, and at one point he was invited to Queen Charlotte's birthday party, and there he met her son, the Prince of Wales, who would eventually become King George IV. And he played the cello. And apparently, according to Haydn, he wasn't bad, and he liked music, and he liked Haydn's music a lot. And he put on concerts featuring Haydn's music, and he presented the Paris Symphonies for the first time in London. And while he was there, he met so many people, just fascinating people, many of whom really just loved meeting Haydn, one of whom was a great British music historian whose name was Sir Charles Burney. And he described one meeting with Haydn. He said, "I spent the day yesterday with the dear, great, and good Haydn, whom I love more and more every time I see him as well as hear him." But among those who loved Haydn the most during his trip to London, and really during his second trip to London a few years later, was a beautiful and wealthy widow whose name was Rebecca Schroeter. And she signed up for piano lessons with Haydn, seems to have fallen completely in love with him. And we know that because she wrote 24 letters to him. And we don't have those letters. What we have are Haydn's handwritten copies of the letters. He was so taken with them that he saved them. And I'll read you an example, just part of one. She wrote, "My heart was and is full of tenderness for you, but no language can express half the love and affection that I feel for you. You are dearer to me every day of my life." And we don't know exactly how Haydn felt about her because his letters don't exist to her. But he did, when he got back to Vienna, write to a friend of his, and he said, "She was a beautiful and amiable woman whom I might very easily have married if I had been free then." And during his second trip to London a couple of years later, he dedicated 3 of his greatest piano trios to her, including his Gypsy Trio, probably his most famous piano trio because of its fiery gypsy-flavored last movement. But apropos of this tender-hearted relationship that they had, I'll play you a bit of the second movement because I think this tender-hearted music probably expresses more directly the way they were feeling about each other. This visit to London was an enormously gratifying visit for him. The British public loved him, they loved his music, and he had a lot to do there. And so after a while, he had to begin to cut down on his socializing because he had to write 6 symphonies and an opera, and he knew he wasn't going to get it done unless he were to just quash some of this activity. But there was one event that he made sure to attend, and that took place in July of 1791. He was invited to go to Oxford University and receive a doctorate. And for him, this was a very important event in his life. We remember again, he came from this small rural town of Rohrau down in southern Austria. And now he's consorting with kings and queens, and he's being asked to come to Oxford University to receive a doctorate. And for the rest of his life, he liked to call himself and sign his letters Dr. Haydn. It meant a great deal to him. And of course, this event was permeated with concerts, and he performed at quite a few of these, and he conducted his 92nd symphony, which he had actually written before he came to London, but it became known in his honor as the Oxford Symphony. Such exuberant music, and they loved it, of course. And the critic from the morning paper, the London Morning Herald, wrote, "A more wonderful composition never was heard." The applause given to Haydn, who conducted this admirable effort of his genius, was enthusiastic. But the merit of the work, in the opinion of all the musicians present, exceeded all praise. So he remained in London until 1792. And finally, he received an order from Prince Anton, the Esterhazy prince, who didn't like music so much. He said, "Meet me in Frankfurt. We're going to be there for the coronation of Francis II, the new Holy Roman Emperor." And so he reluctantly said goodbye, got in the boat and headed across the channel, went back to the continent, worked his way down to Bonn on his way to Frankfurt, and there he looked up Beethoven again, who had become 22 years old. And it was agreed during this meeting that Beethoven would go down to Vienna and would study with him. Beethoven had been to Vienna once before in his life. That was 5 years before, when he was 16 years old in 1787. And he had gone specifically because he wanted to study with Mozart. Mozart was his idol. And when he got there, very sadly, he received a note that his mother was dying and he had to pack up and go right back to Bonn. And if he met Mozart at all, it was only in a cursory way and he didn't get to study with him. So this was a disappointment. And now he was going to study with Haydn because Mozart had died. And so as he's heading out the door, he got a letter from his patron there in Bonn, whose name was Count Waldstein. And he said, "In leaving for Vienna today, you are on the point of realizing a long-cherished desire. The wandering genius of Mozart still grieves for his passing. With Haydn's unquenchable spirit, it has found shelter, but not home, and it longs to find some lasting habitation. Work hard, and the spirit of Mozart's genius will come to you from Haydn's hands." And so he went to Vienna and he studied nominally with Haydn for a while. And as I said much earlier, it didn't work out very well. Haydn was this elegant, older gentleman, and Beethoven was brash and young, and he knew what he wanted, and whatever it was that he wanted, he didn't feel that he was getting from Haydn. And he began to peel off and start to study counterpoint with other people. And I'm sure that Haydn must have been aware of this, and so their relationship was not really very close. And eventually, in a fit of pique, Beethoven said, "I never learned anything from Haydn," which of course is nonsense. If you listen to his early music, it's full of Haydn's influence, particularly his second string quartet, Opus 18, number 2, in G major, which is just saturated with Haydn-esque humor and this style of musical repartee. Some wag once called this quartet the greatest Haydn quartet that Haydn never wrote. Throughout their lives, things were not really so good between Beethoven and Haydn. This was not the case between Haydn and Mozart. They remained very close throughout their lives. And when Mozart died in 1791, this was a devastating moment for Haydn. And he wrote a letter to a friend of Mozart, a lodge brother from the Masonic lodge named Michael Puchberg. And he said, "For some time, I was beside myself about his death, and I could not believe that Providence would so soon claim the life of such an indispensable man. Posterity will not see such a talent again in 100 years. And this return to Vienna was a little bit melancholy for him. For one reason or another, the Viennese public was a little cool to his reception, and he had to deal with the absence of Mozart, and also his confidant, Marianne von Genzinger, who was in her 40s, died as well. And in 1793, he wrote a really very affecting piano piece in the lamenting key of F minor. It's called Andante and Variations. And he dedicated it to a student of Mozart, an outstanding pianist of the day named Barbara Ployer. But the piece itself, it's very poignant in its nature, and it has recurring this funereal rhythm, bum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum, which leads people to believe that perhaps in his heart of hearts that this was his memorial for Mozart himself. That eloquent performance was recorded 50 years ago by Gil Kalish, who you can get to hear play Haydn on tomorrow. So this return to Vienna was not a really happy one, and perhaps it stoked his desire to return to London, which he did in 1794, and he stayed for 2 years more. And his times in London were really, in many ways, the high point of his life. They loved him in London. And of course, he had spent much of his life writing for a single person, Prince Nicholas. And he was a man who liked to please, and so he wrote music to appeal to his patrons. But the British just loved his music more than anybody and egged him on to higher and higher musical heights. And over the course of his 2 visits, he wrote 12 symphonies that are known collectively as his London Symphonies. At the end of his second trip, on May the 4th, 1795, they gave a benefit concert in his honor. And at that concert, he conducted the premiere of his valedictory symphony, number 104, which we know today as the London Symphony. can really get a sense from that piece of how London felt to Haydn. And at the end of this performance, he went home to his lodging there in London, and he wrote into his diary, "I gave my benefit concert in the Haymarket Theatre. The room was full of a select company. The whole company was thoroughly pleased, and so was I. I made 4,000 gulden on this evening. Such a thing is only possible in England." So this time he returned a wealthy man to Vienna, and he bought himself this house. And he sat down and he began to write what were to become his valedictory pieces. And in 1779, he wrote his last two string quartets, presumably in this house, Opus 77, numbers 1 and 2. They were actually part of a commission for 6 quartets from Prince Lobkowitz. He only wrote 2. And interestingly, at that time, Prince Lobkowitz commissioned Beethoven to write his first 6 string quartets as well, his Opus 18 set. Of course, Beethoven completed his inaugural set. People wonder, why didn't Haydn complete his? Some people speculate maybe he simply, at that age, didn't want to subject himself to possibly odious comparisons with his erstwhile student, Beethoven. Who knows? But what we do know is that here he is, he's pushing 70s, in his late 60s, he's still at the height of his artistic game. And I'll play you the beginning of Opus 77, number 1, so you can see what I'm talking about. 5 years before that happened, he was still in London, 1794, and he got word that Prince Anton had died and was succeeded by Prince Nicholas II. This is the grandson of Nicholas I, his main Esterhazy prince. And he was, I guess he liked art. He may have liked music, but really I think he understood by this time that his Kapellmeister, Haydn, was so celebrated that it made him look good. And so, to a degree, he resurrected his position there as the Kapellmeister, but only to a degree. He asked that Haydn write one mass every year. On the name day of his wife, he would have them presented. And these are symphonic scale masks and great pieces. And I think that it was very important to Haydn at this stage of his life to be writing religious music. Earlier in his life, when he was working for Prince Nicholas I, he didn't write all that much liturgical music for the simple reason that Prince Nicholas I liked symphonies, and he liked operas, and he liked baritone music, and he liked string quartets, but he didn't really like church music. Now was his chance to write church music. He wrote these great symphonic scale masses. One of them he wrote in 1796. It's called the Mass in the Time of War. It's also called the Kettle Drum Mass. And it's called that because at the time that he wrote it, down in Italy, in northern Italy, outside of Mantua, the Austrian troops down there were under attack by Napoleon's army. And the people in Vienna were aware of the fact that war was coming their way, and they were very concerned about that. And so Haydn weaves this awareness of war in their consciousness into the tapestry of this piece. And you can hear kettle drums, distant, marching along. You hear war trumpets. And all of this deepens the effect, particularly in the Agnus Dei movement. There's this line, God have mercy, and this sense of war on the way is deepened. hear the war intruding on their consciousness. And in league with this feeling that he really should be writing liturgical music, while he was still in London, he had gone to performances of Handel oratorios like The Messiah. And he had decided that he wanted to write a biblically based oratorio himself. And while he was there, he was given a libretto that apparently had been written originally for Handel himself, based on the opening chapters of Genesis about the creation. And he brought it back with him to Vienna, and he presented it to Baron Gottfried von Swieten, who was a Dutch-born diplomat who was very well-educated, and he translated it into German from English, and Haydn set to work on it. And this was an enormously important project to him, to the point where when he was finished, he wrote to a friend, and he said, "Daily I fell on my knees, and I begged God to vouchsafe me strength for the fortunate outcome of my work. I felt so penetrated with religious feeling that before I sat down at the pianoforte, I prayed to God with earnestness that he would enable me to praise him worthily." And, God really must have been listening, because this is one of the great pieces that Haydn or anybody ever wrote. And the opening two parts are based on the opening chapters of Genesis, and we have the creation of the universe and the earth and the seas and the creatures of the earth and Adam and Eve. But before any of that begins, there is this astonishingly imaginative rendition of chaos in the primordial universe before creation took place. And he writes these untethered harmonies that just float amorphously through the unformed universe. And eventually the chorus says, "And God said, let there be light." And on the word light, there is this flood of C major harmony that just illuminates the universe in this startling evocation of a musical Big Bang. Okay, we got it. Third part, at the end of it, Adam and Eve and the choir of angels and all of creation join together to praise and celebrate God for his great accomplishment. And they do this in full Handelian fugal glory. This was his most successful piece. in everywhere that it was played, particularly in Vienna. At the end of his life, it was performed 40 times while he was still alive, often under his own direction in benefit concerts for the widows and the orphans of musicians. Not long after he completed this, he was presented with the libretto for another oratorio that was The Seasons, and he wrote this, and it is his praise of God for his terrestrial accomplishments. Another great, great masterpiece. But these back-to-back oratorios really took it out of him. And as he entered into his 70s, he went from a man in the full command of his energy and his creative forces to being a very old and very infirm man very quickly. And he wrote about that to his publisher. Every day the world pays me compliments on the fire of my recent works, but no one will believe the strain and effort it causes me to produce them. There are some days in which my enfeebled memory and the unstrung state of my nerves crush me to the earth to such an extent that I fall prey to the worst sort of depression. And thus I am quite incapable of finding even a single idea for many days afterwards. But he did become this figure of veneration. And every day as he wrote, people were coming and giving him awards and prizes and medals, and they were coming to just meet him and shake his hand. And on his 76th birthday, there was this great event in his honor at which they presented a performance of the Creation. And that's the one at which Beethoven came and kissed his hands and kissed his feet, not his feet, his forehead, and knelt at his feet. Okay. Kissed something. This is a long trip, isn't it? Anyway, his biographer was there. His name was Albert Christoph Dies, and he wrote, "The crowd was very large, so that a military guard had to see that order was kept. Now Haydn, seated in an armchair, was borne along aloft at his entrance into the hall, to the sound of trumpets and timpani, and was received by the numerous assemblage and greeted with the joyful cry, 'Long live Haydn.'" In 1809, the following year, Napoleon rolled his howitzers up to the outskirts of the city, and they unleashed this terrible bombing campaign, which sent everybody running to their basements, including Beethoven, who was in town at that time. He went to the basement of his brother, and he held pillows against his ears to try to protect what was left of his ravaged hearing. And Haydn, he was there, and apparently during the night, 4 cannonballs landed very close to his home, and they exploded. And they rattled the windows, and they rattled Haydn, and he rattled the servants. And at one point, he said to the servants, "Children, don't be afraid, for where Haydn is, nothing can happen." But unfortunately, it wasn't true. I mean, he declined a lot. This bombing took place in early May. He died on May the 31st, 1809. And his body was buried in this very simple grave in Vienna. And 2 weeks later, there was a memorial service in his behalf, and they played Mozart's Requiem, and emissaries from the luminaries of Vienna and also the occupying French forces, they all came. Everybody wanted to celebrate Haydn regardless of their national origin. And I think that this long story of Haydn's life and his music would not be complete without a recounting of the bizarre postscript, which I think probably should have been written by Edgar Allan Poe with an assist from Monty Python. I'll tell you this story as quickly as I can. 11 years after he was buried in this grave, Prince Nicholas said, "We need to move him to a more appropriately ornate tomb on the Eisenstadt property of the Esterházy family." And so he ordered that Haydn's grave be dug up. And in the process, they opened the tomb. They opened the coffin. And they discovered to their startlement that Haydn's head was missing. And this infuriated the prince, and he said, I put out a reward to anybody who can tell me what happened to Haydn's head. And it turned out that his head had been stolen for purposes of phrenological study. There was this odd pseudoscience at the end of the 18th and the early 19th century where they believed that you could determine personality characteristics by examining the bumps on the skull of a person. And there was a person who was an amateur phrenologist named Johann Nepomuk Pater, who was the head of the imperial prison system there, and he wanted to use phrenology to see if he could figure out how to understand criminal behavior. And he was in the habit of taking the heads of people who had died within the prison system and subjecting them to phrenological study. But being a good scientist, he decided as a basis of comparison, he needed the head of an authentic genius. And so when he heard that Haydn had died, he said, oh, this is my chance. And he called up a friend of Haydn, whose name was Joseph Karl Rosenbaum. And they snuck into the graveyard 4 days after he was buried in the dead of night, and they bribed the gravekeeper, and they dug up his coffin, and they opened it, and they took his head, and they went off and they subjected it to phrenological studies. Apparently they discovered that it had musical bumps or something. And when they were done, they put it on the shelf. And eventually Prince Nicholas figured out what was going on, and he said, you must return Haydn's head now. And they said, right you are. And they went to the local mortician, and they bought a head, and they gave it to the prince, who had it examined, and they said, this is not Haydn's head, this is a much younger head. And they said something to the effect of, right. And so they went back to the mortician, and they got an older head, which was also not Haydn's. And they gave it to the prince, and he couldn't tell the difference, so they buried it. And at the end of this gentleman's life, before he died, he revealed, in fact, here's Haydn's head. And he turned it over to the Friends, the Society of the Friends of Music in Vienna. And from there, it bounced around Vienna for the next 120 years until the end of World War II. And at that time, Haydn's body and somebody else's head was resting comfortably in the grave at Eisenstadt in an area that was under Soviet control. And Haydn's head was in Vienna in this internationally divided sector. Maybe you remember the movie The Third Man with Orson Welles, which takes place at this time in this internationally divided sector. I find myself thinking somebody should make a sequel called The Third Man's Head. Anyway, finally in 1954, Haydn's head was finally reunited with his body a mere 145 years after he had died. And in case you're wondering what happened to the second man's head, apparently it's in this tomb along with Haydn's head. I feel like this part of the presentation should be called Haydn Disconnections or something. Anyway, it's been nice seeing you all. And I hope to see you again. And thank you for listening to this endless conversation.